Story 1: The Whispering Trees. The forest was too quiet. That was the first thing Jess noticed when she stepped out of the car, her boots crunching on the brittle pine needles scattered across the ground. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, but there was no birdsong, no rustle of squirrels in the underbrush, not even the faint hum of insects. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. "You sure this is the right spot?" she called over her shoulder, squinting at the map on her phone. "No service, of course." Her boyfriend, Mark, slammed the trunk of their SUV shut and hoisted his backpack onto his shoulders. "Yeah, this is it. Pine Hollow Campground. Or what's left of it." He gestured to the overgrown trail ahead, where a faded wooden sign leaned precariously to one side, its letters barely legible. Jess frowned. "Doesn't look like anyone's been here in years." "That's the point," Mark said with a grin. "No tourists, no RVs, no noise. Just us and nature." Jess forced a smile, but the unease in her gut didn't go away. She'd never been a fan of camping, but Mark had been talking about this trip for months. A weekend in the woods, just the two of them, reconnecting after a rough patch in their relationship. She'd agreed, partly because she loved him and partly because she felt guilty for how distant she'd been lately. But now, standing at the edge of the silent forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were making a mistake. They hiked for about an hour before finding a suitable spot to set up camp, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The ground was soft and mossy, and a narrow stream trickled nearby, its water icy cold. "See? Perfect," Mark said, dropping his backpack and stretching his arms above his head. Jess nodded, but her eyes kept darting to the trees. They were too close together, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their roots snaking across the ground like skeletal fingers. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Let's get the tent up before it gets dark," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. Mark gave her a curious look but didn't argue. They worked in silence, the only sounds the rustle of fabric and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. By the time the tent was pitched and the fire pit dug, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in an eerie twilight. That's when the whispers started. At first, Jess thought it was the wind. A faint, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But as the night deepened and the fire crackled to life, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark looked up from the hot dog he was roasting over the fire. "Hear what?" "That sound. Like someone whispering." Mark frowned and tilted his head, listening. For a moment, there was only the crackle of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of voices, soft, sibilant, and utterly alien. Mark's eyes widened. "Okay, yeah. I hear it." Jess's heart began to race. "What is it?" "Probably just the wind," Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe some kind of animal. Owls, or I don't know, bats or something." Jess nodded, but the explanation did little to ease her nerves. The whispers didn't sound like any animal she'd ever heard. They sounded almost human. By the time they crawled into the tent that night, the whispers had faded into the background, but Jess couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She lay awake long after Mark had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling of the tent and listening to the sounds of the forest. That's when she heard it again. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was her name. Jess. The voice was faint, almost melodic, and it seemed to come from right outside the tent. Her breath caught in her throat, and she reached over to shake Mark awake. "Mark," she hissed. "Mark, wake up." He groaned and rolled over. "What?" "There's someone out there." Mark sat up, rubbing his eyes. What are you talking about? I heard someone say my name. Outside the tent. Mark listened for a moment, then shook his head. I don't hear anything. You're probably just tired. Go back to sleep. Jess wanted to argue, but the voice didn't come again, and eventually, exhaustion overtook her. The next morning, the forest seemed almost normal. Birds chirped in the distance, and the sunlight filtering through the trees was warm and golden. Jess began to wonder if she'd imagined the whispers, if the stress of the past few months had finally gotten to her. But then Mark went to gather firewood and didn't come back. At first, Jess wasn't worried. He'd only been gone for a few minutes, and the forest was dense, it was easy to lose track of time. But as the minutes turned into hours, her unease grew. She called his name, her voice echoing through the trees, but there was no response. Finally, she grabbed her backpack and set off to look for him. The forest seemed to close in around her as she walked, the trees growing taller and darker, their branches twisting together to form a canopy so thick it blocked out the sun. And then she heard it. Jess. The voice was louder now, more insistent, and it seemed to come from all around her. She spun in circles, her heart pounding, but there was no one there. Mark, she shouted, her voice trembling. Where are you? The only response was the whispers, growing louder and more urgent, until they were almost deafening. And then, through the trees, she saw it. A massive oak, its trunk twisted and gnarled, its branches reaching out like skeletal arms. And carved into its bark were faces, dozens of them, their features twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. Jess stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. And then she saw him. Mark. He was standing at the base of the tree, his back to her, his head tilted as if listening to something. Mark, she screamed, running toward him. But as she got closer, she realized something was wrong. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were wide and unseeing. And then she saw the roots, thick, black tendrils snaking up his legs, wrapping around his torso, pulling him into the tree. Jess, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Help me. She reached for him, but it was too late. The roots pulled him into the tree, his body merging with the bark, his face joining the others carved into its surface. And then the whispers stopped. Jess doesn't remember how she got out of the forest. She doesn't remember the hike back to the car, the drive home, or the days that followed. All she remembers is the tree, its faces staring at her, their mouths moving in silent screams. She tried to tell people what happened, but no one believed her. Mark's disappearance was ruled a tragic accident, and the forest was declared off-limits. But Jess knows the truth. Sometimes, late at night, she hears the whispers again, faint but unmistakable, calling her name. And she knows that the tree is still out there, waiting, hungry for more. Because the forest wasn't holding its breath that day. It was waiting for dinner. Story 2: The Fire That Didn't Burn. The first time I saw the fire, I thought it was a trick of the light. It was late October, and the air had turned sharp and brittle, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and distant wood smoke. My family had just moved into the old Victorian house on the edge of Black Hollow, a town so small it barely warranted a dot on the map. The house was a relic of another time, with its peeling white paint, sagging porch, and windows that seemed to stare out at you like the eyes of a dead thing. My wife, Claire, had fallen in love with it instantly. "It's got character," she'd said, her voice brimming with the kind of optimism that made me want to believe her. But character, as I would soon learn, can be a dangerous thing. The fire appeared in the hearth of the living room fireplace on our second night in the house. It was a cold evening, and Claire had suggested we light a fire to take the chill out of the air. I'd never been much of a handyman, but I managed to get a decent blaze going. We sat together on the couch, our daughter, Emily, curled up between us with a book, and for a moment, everything felt right. That's when I noticed it. The flames in the fireplace were wrong. They didn't flicker or dance like normal fire. They burned too still, too cold, casting a pale, bluish light that made the shadows in the room seem deeper, darker. And the heat, there was no heat. I reached out toward the flames, expecting to feel the usual warmth, but there was nothing. Just a cold, empty void. "Do you see that?" I asked Claire, my voice low. She glanced at the fire and frowned. "See what?" "The fire. It's not right." She gave me a puzzled look, then shrugged. "Looks fine to me. Maybe you're just tired." I wanted to believe her. God, how I wanted to believe her. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The fire didn't go out. No matter how much time passed, no matter how little wood we added, the flames continued to burn with that same cold, unnatural light. By morning, the logs were reduced to ash, but the fire remained, as if it were feeding on something else. I tried to ignore it at first. Told myself it was just a draft, or maybe some trick of the old chimney. But then the dreams started. They were always the same. I'd find myself standing in front of the fireplace, staring into those cold, blue flames. And then I'd hear it, a voice, whispering from deep within the fire. It was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a voice that made my skin crawl and my stomach twist. "You know what you did," it would say. "You can't hide from it forever." I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, and for a moment, I'd be convinced that the voice was real. That it was still there, waiting for me. It wasn't long before the others started to notice. Emily was the first. She'd always been a sensitive child, prone to nightmares and bouts of anxiety, but this was different. She began to avoid the living room, refusing to go near the fireplace. When we asked her why, she'd just shake her head and say, "The fire's angry." Claire tried to laugh it off. "Kids have such wild imaginations," she said. But I could see the unease in her eyes. She'd started to notice the fire too, how it never went out, how it seemed to grow stronger at night, casting strange shadows on the walls. And then there were the secrets. It started small. A misplaced key, a forgotten appointment. But soon, it was as if the fire was pulling things out of us, things we'd buried deep down, things we'd never meant to say. One night, after a particularly bad argument, Claire turned to me and said, "Do you ever feel like the fire is watching us?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. We both knew the truth. The fire wasn't just a fire. It was alive. It fed on our emotions, our fears, our guilt. The more we tried to ignore it, the stronger it grew. It began to spread, not in the way a normal fire would, but in a way that defied logic. It would appear in the corners of rooms, in the reflection of mirrors, even in the palms of our hands. And then there were the visions. I'd catch glimpses of things in the flames, faces, twisted and charred, their mouths open in silent screams. Sometimes, I'd see myself, my skin blackened and peeling, my eyes hollow and empty. Claire saw them too. She tried to hide it, but I could tell by the way she avoided looking at the fire, by the way she'd flinch when I touched her. Emily stopped talking altogether. She'd sit in her room for hours, staring at the wall, her eyes wide and unblinking. When I asked her what was wrong, she'd just shake her head and whisper, "It's coming." The breaking point came on a cold, moonless night. I was alone in the living room, staring into the fire, when I heard the voice again. "You can't run from it," it said. "You can't hide." I tried to look away, but I couldn't. The flames had me trapped, their cold light burning into my eyes. And then I saw it. A figure, emerging from the fire. It was tall and thin, its body charred and smoldering, its face a twisted mask of pain and rage. It stepped out of the fireplace, its movements slow and deliberate, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it was me. The charred figure reached out, its fingers brushing against my skin, and I felt a searing pain, as if my flesh were being burned away. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and that's when I noticed it. The fire had spread. It was everywhere, on the walls, the ceiling, the floor. But it wasn't burning the house. It was burning us. Claire and Emily were standing in the doorway, their faces pale and drawn. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. But it was too late. The fire surged forward, engulfing us in its cold, blue light. I felt myself being pulled apart, my thoughts and memories stripped away, until there was nothing left but the fire. When I woke up, the house was silent. The fire was gone, but the damage was done. Claire and Emily were gone too. In their place were two charred, smoldering figures, their faces twisted in expressions of agony. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do something, but I couldn't. I was empty, hollow, like a shell that had been burned out from the inside. And then I saw it. In the mirror, my reflection was gone. In its place was the charred figure I'd seen in the fire, its eyes hollow and empty, its mouth twisted into a grimace of pain. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the glass, and I felt a cold, searing pain, as if my flesh were being burned away. And then I realized the truth. The fire hadn't just taken my family. It had taken me too. Now, I sit here in the darkness, staring into the cold, blue flames, waiting for the next poor soul to stumble into this cursed house. Because the fire doesn't burn. It consumes. And it's always hungry. Story 3: The campsite that wasn't there. The first thing that struck me about the campsite was how perfect it seemed. Too perfect. My wife, Claire, and I had been driving for hours through the dense, unyielding forests of northern Maine. The kind of forest where the trees grow so close together they seem to whisper secrets to one another, their gnarled branches knitting a canopy so thick it blotted out the sun. We were lost, hopelessly, irrevocably lost, and the GPS on my phone had given up an hour ago, its screen flickering before going dark. Claire had been quiet for most of the drive, her hands gripping the wheel tightly, her knuckles white. She didn't like the woods. Never had. "We should have stayed at the motel," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "We'll find a spot soon," I said, trying to sound reassuring. But the truth was, I wasn't so sure. The road we were on, if you could even call it a road, was little more than a dirt path, riddled with potholes and overgrown with weeds. It didn't look like anyone had driven on it in years. And then, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, we saw it. The campsite. It was nestled in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. There was a fire pit in the center, its stones blackened from use, and a stack of neatly chopped firewood nearby. A picnic table sat beneath a wooden shelter, and beyond that, a narrow trail led deeper into the woods. It was like something out of a postcard. "This is it," I said, pulling the car to a stop. "This is perfect." Claire didn't say anything. She just stared at the campsite, her expression unreadable. We set up camp quickly, eager to get a fire going before the last of the light faded. The air was cool, and the smell of pine was almost overwhelming. It should have been peaceful. But there was something about the place that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was too quiet. No birdsong. No rustling of leaves. Just silence. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as the fire crackled to life and the shadows grew longer, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. Claire must have felt it too, because she kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes darting nervously toward the trees. "Do you hear that?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I listened. At first, I didn't hear anything. But then, faintly, I caught the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, crunching through the underbrush. Probably just an animal, I said, though I didn't believe it. The footsteps grew louder, closer. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. We sat in silence, the fire casting flickering shadows on the trees. I could feel Claire's fear, palpable in the air between us. "We should go," she said finally, her voice trembling. I wanted to agree. To pack up the car and drive as far away from this place as possible. But something stopped me. Something I couldn't explain. "It's just one night," I said. "We'll leave first thing in the morning." Claire didn't argue. But she didn't look convinced either. We slept fitfully that night, the sound of the wind through the trees keeping us both on edge. And then, just before dawn, I woke to the sound of Claire screaming. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. Claire was sitting up in her sleeping bag, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "What is it?" I asked, my voice hoarse with sleep. She didn't answer. She just pointed toward the fire pit. I turned, and my blood ran cold. There, sitting on one of the stones, was a journal. A small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn and cracked with age. I don't remember getting out of my sleeping bag. Don't remember walking over to the fire pit. But somehow, I found myself standing there, the journal in my hands. I opened it. The first page was blank. So was the second. But on the third page, there was writing. Neat, precise handwriting that sent a chill down my spine. Because it was my handwriting. "We shouldn't have come here," the first line read. "But it's too late now. They're already here." I flipped through the pages, my hands trembling. The entries were all the same. All written in my handwriting. All describing things that hadn't happened yet. "Claire will scream tonight. She'll see something in the trees. Something that shouldn't be there. The footsteps will come again. Closer this time. They'll stop just outside the tent. We'll try to leave in the morning. But the road will be gone. The car won't start. And we'll realize we're trapped." I dropped the journal, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Claire was staring at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. "What is it?" she asked. I couldn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just read. And then, as if on cue, the footsteps started again. This time, they were right outside the tent. The next morning, we tried to leave. Just like the journal said we would. But the road was gone. Where the dirt path had been, there was now nothing but dense forest. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The car wouldn't start. No matter how many times I turned the key, the engine refused to catch. We were trapped. And as the days turned into weeks, we began to notice other things. Strange things. The fire pit was always full of fresh wood, even though we never chopped any. The cooler we'd brought was always stocked with food, though we never went shopping. And every night, without fail, the footsteps would come. Sometimes they were far away. Sometimes they were right outside the tent. But they never stopped. We tried to leave on foot, following the trail that led deeper into the woods. But no matter which direction we went, we always ended up back at the campsite. It was like the forest was alive. Like it was playing with us. And then, one night, Claire disappeared. I woke up to find her sleeping bag empty. The journal was gone too. I searched the campsite, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. Just the endless trees and the suffocating silence. I don't know how long I've been here now. Days? Weeks? Months? Time doesn't seem to matter anymore. The footsteps still come every night. And sometimes, if I listen closely, I can hear Claire's voice, faint and distant, calling my name. But I know it's not really her. Because last night, I found the journal again. It was sitting on the picnic table, its pages filled with my handwriting. "You'll never leave," the last entry read. "But you're not alone. They're watching. Always watching. I don't know who they are. But I can feel them. In the trees. In the shadows. In the silence. And I know, deep down, that this campsite was never meant to be found. It's a trap. And I'm never getting out." Epilogue. The journal was found by a group of hikers 3 months later. They claimed they stumbled upon it in the middle of the woods, though they couldn't explain how it got there. The entries were all the same. Neat, precise handwriting describing a campsite that didn't exist. A campsite that was too perfect. The hikers tried to retrace their steps, to find the place described in the journal. But the forest seemed to shift and change around them, leading them in circles until they were forced to give up. The journal now sits in a glass case at the local library, a curiosity for anyone brave enough to read it. But if you listen closely, late at night, you can still hear the footsteps. And if you're not careful, you might just find yourself at the campsite that wasn't there. And once you're there, you'll never leave.